My name is Ashley Gabrish, and I'm a 2013 Harris School of Public Policy alumna and a 2007 graduate of the college. I'm excited to introduce this quarter's Harris Policy Forum, the topic of which is fresh insights into pension reform, solutions for Chicago. Chicago, like many governments across the U.S., faces a significant challenge: how to ensure the long-term health of its four pension plans while continuing to fund existing and incorporating new spending priorities into its annual budget. For scale, the city's corporate or operating fund budget most recently totaled roughly $6 billion, and annual pension contributions were roughly $3 billion. The city's unfunded pension liabilities total more than $35 billion, whereas the total unfunded pension liabilities across U.S. states and local governments total approximately $1.5 trillion. This Harris Policy Forum brings together a panel of distinguished experts to explore innovative and, in true Harris fashion, evidence-based approaches. We'll delve into the latest trends in pension reform nationally and how they might be applied to the Chicago situation, creative solutions that balance the needs of all stakeholders, and data-driven strategies to ensure the long-term sustainability of Chicago's pension plans. This event is an opportunity to learn about and explore potential solutions to Chicago's pension struggles, and it comes on the heels of the first ever Harris Policy Innovation Challenge, where teams competed to design innovative solutions to address the challenge at hand. We have the winning team here with us tonight, and they'll share their proposal with you shortly. We're very happy to have you here at the Spring Quarter Harris Policy Forum. As a note, please hold your questions until the end when we will open up the conversation to the audience. And now I will turn the program over to Justin Marlowe, Research Professor and Director of the Center of Municipal Finance at Harris, to start the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much, Ashley. It's a pleasure to have you here. Ashley sort of soft-pedaled her own credentials there at the beginning. We're proud to call her a Harris grad and a college grad. We're also proud to call her one of the bond buyers' rising stars from this last year, which is a huge honor in this industry. And, a little bit like the James Beard Awards for public finance. So we're pleased to call her one of our own. So as Ashley mentioned, we've been spending a lot of time the last 6 months working through the Harris Policy Innovation Challenge focused on pensions, and the presentation you'll hear from our students today was the winner among 9 different proposals that came out. We had more than 50 students in total participate in the challenge from start to finish. They came up with lots and lots of interesting ideas, lots and lots of different ways of thinking about the challenge, and lots of interesting ways of framing it and thinking about where we want to go from here. Our goal for the challenge, of course, was to give the students an opportunity to sound off on this. We were thinking about the opportunity that presented itself to say, those who are going to be most directly affected by this challenge and those who are going to be saddled with, in many ways, trying to address it, really haven't had as much to say about what we ought to do about it. So the challenge was an attempt to do exactly that, and we're very, very proud of what came out of it and very excited to see the results. So I want to introduce the team that won. They're going to give you an overview of what they came up with in their presentation, and then we have a great panel discussion to follow up on that and extend and get into some of those ideas in more detail. So with that, without further ado, I want to introduce all of them right from the top. We have Syed Ahmed, who's here. Quick cut, there we go. Anthony Beaupre, who's not here, that's right. Liam Gluck. James Karsten. And Greg Rudd. I also want to mention briefly before they start that this team was mentored by Jack Brofman, who currently works at the University of Chicago, also a Harris alum, gave them some really good input and advice as they were developing their proposals. So without further ado, I'll invite them to come on up, tell us all about their proposal to address Chicago's pension challenges. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Marlowe. So hi, everybody, and thank you for coming. We know that there are many in the room who not only have more expertise, but many, many more hours logged working on the pension issue in Chicago, including especially the folks behind us. So we appreciate that you're listening to us. After months our team spent learning about the history of the challenges and the subsequent reform efforts, we can all certainly agree that it's a thorny issue. My name is Liam Gluck. I'm a dual master's student in business and public policy at UChicago. I'm an aspiring public servant who hopes to hold some sort of elected or appointed office one day. And so I wanted the opportunity to learn about a big, complicated, real-world public sector problem. And so Chicago's underfunded pensions certainly fit the bill.
And my name is Gregory Rudd, and like Liam, I am a master's student pursuing degrees in business administration and public policy at the University of Chicago. You just met them, but I wanted to shout out my teammates, Ahmad and James again, who've been leading us through this challenge. Among my many identities are native Chicagoan, former educator, and grandson. These identities are relevant to this topic for numerous reasons that I'll outline now. I took this approach because as a former educator, I know how pensions can affect city services. I took this approach because as a native Chicagoan, I know how important solving this issue is going to be for the future of our city. And I took part in this challenge because as a grandson to two octogenarian pensioners, I know that their future really does rely upon us solving this issue because they are beating actuarial predictions with every trip around the sun at this point. So to most Chicagoans, these identities would not be directly relevant to the topic of pension reform. However, as our team came to find out, when a city's pensions are on the precipice, all of the residents in that city are vulnerable to increased taxes, vulnerable to decreased city services, and vulnerable to discarding retired city workers like my grandparents. Fortunately, in Chicago, there are many talented and well-meaning people who have been working on this topic for many years, including, I'm sure, many of you who are in this room. As our team gathered background and attended policy seminars, including one led by Jenny Bennett, we were very impressed to learn about the efforts that have taken place specifically over the last 15 years to get serious about funding the city's pension funds. We began our analysis with this history in mind, hoping to build upon the recent responsible reforms, including the introductions of Tiers 2 and 3, while also being imaginative to think about new opportunities to solve this issue.
Our teammate Ahmad wisely suggested that we structure the pension problem around a framework through which we could organize our potential solutions. He essentially followed the money cycle through the pension fund to create three buckets that you see here: funding, growth, and liabilities. Starting with funding, or funds in, that was where we were thinking about money that is contributed to the funds by employees, employers, the city, and other government revenue streams. Next was funds grow, looking at how the money is actually invested. And finally, funds out, or the annuities owed or paid to retirees. This framework allowed us to classify problems and their solutions as affecting money flow in one of these three buckets. We evaluated 28 ideas, eventually narrowing down to 9 based on feasibility and efficacy. There are 7 funding initiatives, 1 growth initiative, and 1 liability initiative.
You can access our final proposal at the QR code on your screen. It will outline our detailed analyses and also in full detail our 9 proposed ideas. In our process, we decided that we must avoid increasing the already heavy tax burden that Chicagoans currently carry. It was essential that our ideas convey to all stakeholders that the responsibility for solving this issue is a shared one, and therefore everything possible is being done before requesting additional concessions from any one group. That's why we suggested reforms in investing decision-making, vesting structures, tier adoption, contribution assumption methods, and others. As Jack Lavin, president of the Chicago Chamber, put it concisely, reform before revenue. Or as a Twitter user in the days since we've made this proposal public put it not so eloquently, so they want to tax the working class? I know they got a C- on this project.
The parts of our proposal that will appeal to Chamber of Commerce members and the Twitter pundits alike are economic development initiatives, namely deregulating marijuana licensing and revamping the process through which city vacant lots are sold. On the dispensary front, we compared Illinois' number of licenses to that in Washington and Colorado, who grant 4 times and 6 times as many licenses to small business owners. If Illinois followed suit, Chicago could capture customers who purchase illegally, grow the retail sector, and generate a conservative estimate of $15 million in tax revenue. For the vacant lots case, we looked at a case out of Trenton, New Jersey, who were able to increase their lot sales by 81% in 1 year thanks to a targeted social media campaign and software that allowed users to compare different lots side by side online. If Chicago were to adopt these methods within Chai Building Block, the Lightfoot platform, our conservative estimate is a $15 million increase in annual revenue from sales and property tax levies. The political will behind this would be huge. Residents will love a new home or business in their neighborhood and the increase in their own property value. Community organizations could steer the development, and aldermen could hang their hat on improving a block in their jurisdiction. Developers, of course, will appreciate the increase in business too. We are hopeful that these initiatives could provide some political capital to other not so favorable initiatives, like the very buzzy and contentious Lakeshore Drive toll and the change to the vesting structure we propose. We know we face other hurdles too, like those identified by Jack and Jenny in their seminars, namely the difficulty of plying money out of Springfield, the current union efforts to abate the new tier concessions, and the reticence of funds to work together when it comes to investment management.
In the weeks since our presentation, we've been genuinely excited about the amount of attention that our proposal has received. As Liam mentioned, during our team's work, we knew the importance of community support in advancing our ideas. But as we've heard in the last week from pension professionals, from attorneys, and from genuinely curious city residents, it is more obvious now that engaging a wide cross-section of Chicagoans will be essential in refining our ideas. For example, in the last week, we've learned that there is legal precedent that distinguishes tolls from taxes. And many experts do believe that Chicago would be well within their rights to implement a toll on Lakeshore Drive. We also learned that in the last decade, Arizona has twice amended its state constitution to enable pension reform. As its previous iteration said, quote, "Public retirement system benefits shall not be diminished or impaired," end quote. As some of you may know, this language is very similar to the current language in our own Illinois state constitution. Perhaps the most important lesson we've learned in the last week since our final presentation has come from the coverage that our proposal has received in local media. That lesson, when advocating for a public policy change, especially a change related to a policy that is often overlooked, issue framing is essential. We want Chicagoans to feel confident that pension issues will not erode the city's ability to deliver essential services. We want retirees to feel confident that they will have a solid retirement security. And we want taxpayers to feel confident that their hard-earned money is being used responsibly and fairly. So here's the issue framing upon which we decided. Necessary pension reform will provide an opportunity for all Chicagoans to engage in a democratic conversation about how the city can both keep its promises and fulfill its responsibility to all residents while being a good financial steward.
Overall, we learned that there is no quick fix solution, otherwise it would have been done already. The most effective plan will be comprehensive, last over multiple mayoral administrations, and will require sacrifices across business, resident, and city employee constituencies. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you so much, Greg and Liam. What a wonderful presentation. And as you can see, they make teaching at the Harris School a lot of fun and certainly make us all proud in the creativity and the careful, comprehensive thinking that went into all of those proposals. So one more round of applause for the winners. So to build on that, we have 2 experts to give us all kinds of interesting perspectives on this. We have Jenny Bennett, Associate Vice President for Finance at the University of Chicago. Right up until going to the university, was the Chief Finance Officer for the City of Chicago. Prior to that, also served as the CFO for Chicago Public Schools, and also spent some time as a public finance investment banker, although we won't hold that against her, at least for the time being. In her time at the city, certainly helped us through COVID, worked on many of the pension challenges that we're talking about here tonight, and in general has just a wonderful perspective. So very glad to have you, Jenny. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
We also have Chase Ramickle. Chase is currently the city controller here in Chicago, and for anyone unfamiliar, of course, the controller actually moves the money around and is responsible for keeping track of the money, which is a rather important job, if I don't say so. Prior to that role, he was at the state in a bunch of different roles. He was the state banking director, also held roles at the state controller and at the state treasurer's office. We're proud to call him an alum, and also proud to call him a professor at the Harris School, teaching a really well-received course on banking and banking regulation. Let me first start by saying thank you to both of you for all the great work that you have done. Public finance is, of course, a thankless job wrapped up in a thankless job, so we really appreciate all the wonderful things that you've done on behalf of our community. So we're going to spend the first half of our time today talking about exactly what the toll on Lakeshore Drive should be, and then we're going to move on and talk about the Sox and the Bears and how much public subsidy should go into stadiums for them. So we'll jump right into things.
I should just leave now then.
So the first question, just to kind of back up and zoom out a little bit, we heard a really interesting issue framing on the part of the students, and I'm wondering from both of your perspectives, we can start with Jenny, when you think about the pension challenge, zooming out a little bit, when you think of the drivers of it, you think of the way we ought to think about it, what comes to mind? Is this a governance challenge? Is it a problem of political will? Is it something else? How do you think about the challenge at a very high level?
Sure. So before I get into the question, I just want to start by thanking you and the Harris School for putting up this pension challenge. I'll just note that over the course of the last several months that we've been through the seminars, the competition, the selection of the winner of the competition, I have seen more awareness around Chicago pensions during that time frame than I have over the last 2 years, at least, if not more. There were 3 editorials in Cranes around the 3 proposals. There was TV coverage. There was coverage in pensions and investments, coverage on Block Club, which is an enormously powerful and sometimes underrated media outlet for popular opinion around financial issues and other community issues. And ultimately, it's just an enormous service to the city to be able to have this conversation around pensions. I myself have texted other folks in the industry, some of which I know spoke, some of which are here, around some of the proposals. Jack and I were at the city together and crafting the pension advance policy. He and I co-created this policy that ultimately led to the upgrade of the city from junk status to investment grade. In the midst of this, we debated a lot of the proposals here. I would offer we did not have the same view, which again goes back to this conversation and having a relevant conversation around pensions in this moment. It's incredibly valuable. So I just want to start by saying that that conversation is really very important, and I appreciate the Harris School for having stirred that. And also one other point on that, something that I struggled as a CFO all the time to gain attention around the issues that we care about by way of financial stability and responsibility. So I also say all of that because I think it's, in large part the response to your question when I think about pensions. The biggest challenge I had at the city as CFO was ultimately getting relevance, attention, and awareness around financial issues, and in particular around pensions. It's a somewhat esoteric topic. It's difficult for most people to understand. And in particular for most lay people who aren't in finance to understand what it means and why pensions are so important. And when I think about the question that you've asked, ultimately what it strikes me as is a threat assessment. What is it that we are trying to solve here? What's the problem? What's the theory of action? And then ultimately what we need to do to address that. I'll give you 2 points of evidence in support of this challenge. How many people in this room are aware of the police born after COLA pension bill? Okay, a few who know. How many people know how much that pension bill costs the city of Chicago in total and on an annual basis? Okay, I got one here. How about the Tier 2 firefighters fix and that pension legislation? And the total cost for that. So this is a room full of experts and people who follow and track public policy issues related to city pensions. And I would offer that, one, there is no public research on this. Aside from what you may think about the legislation, and certainly you probably know my thoughts and you can debate the pros and cons of the legislation, but there is no public research or actual study on the pension bill. And when you go to the Illinois government website on one of the bills, the fiscal impact is noted as having no fiscal impact for the Department of Insurance, which is clearly not what the bill is intended to address. The only actuarial analysis that I'm aware of is one conducted by the City of Chicago, which basically came up with roundly about a $3 billion cost for each of the bills, and an annualized cost of about $60 million for each of the bills, which would make each of those bills, in aggregate those bills, some of the largest increases in pension sweeteners in the history of the state of Illinois. And the fact that there isn't awareness or an analysis around that is, to me, one of the greatest challenges facing pensions.
Sure. Very good, thank you. Chase?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd take just a second to thank the winning team. I have to, Jenny is probably aware of what I'm about to do here. I get to do the whole, what I'm about to say has nothing, is my own opinions. It is not meant to be an endorsement of Chicago or the mayor of Chicago, Brandon Johnson. When I get to your role, I guess I get to skip that part. But before I get into that point, I did want to point out one thing with the winning team, and you're probably going to you already have heard some critiques of your proposal, and you'll probably hear more from Jenny and I and others in the room. And I know Jenny has put forth major financial policy. I know I've worked on some throughout my career as well. And you'll always get the critiques. You'll very rarely get the plaudits. So it is a very tough thing to do, to put yourself forward on a program that is easy to say, this is stupid or that's a bad idea without coming up with any actual results. So I just want to applaud you guys for putting yourself forward and everybody who is also as part of the team. I want to echo what Jenny was saying, and I want to kind of draw it out even further in saying the real challenge I've seen in the pension piece is it's almost an inertia of the concept in general. People might not know, but the first time the state of Illinois said it had a pension plan or a pension issue in a formal setting was the General Assembly constructed a emergency pension commission in 1917. So we've been talking about this a long time. There was a commission in 1945. There was the Constitutional Convention in 1970. My entire public finance career has been with this looming over Illinois. And Illinois and the city of Chicago are kind of unusual compared to all the other neighbors in this field. It's almost, as a good friend of mine who's been involved in state government a long time, they'd always get the criticism from out the side, oh, that's the Wild West, that's Illinois, or that's Chicago. The problem with that is since it's been so long and since it looms over for such a long time, it kind of deadens the actual risk and it makes strategic decisions that are being made related to long-term financial costs really hard, because if you go back every year and say this is a problem, it becomes kind of a sky is falling type scenario. Even though you can show, and as Jenny said, it's hard for people to grasp really large financial decisions that are in the future. Maybe their kids are more impacted, or their grandkids. So that's, I think, the major challenge is because we've been dealing with this for so long, it really makes movement in major ways very challenging.
Indeed. Well, speaking of those risks that you had mentioned, and Ashley in her introduction, and certainly the students in their presentation talked about the cost, the size of the unfunded liability, the big looming threat out there. You both, though, have a unique perspective on what that means much more in terms of the day-to-day implications for how city services are delivered, or credit ratings, or other considerations that maybe we ought to think about that might help to bring some of that threat to life a little bit. I wonder if you could talk, just from your vantage, a little bit more about what are the potential implications of not addressing this? What sorts of threats are we looking at, and how can we maybe think about that a little bit differently relative to that numbing that you described, Chase?
So number one, I would say that it's a vicious cycle if you don't pay your pensions. So the longer you go without paying it, it's a debt, just like a credit card, just like a mortgage, and you build up a mountain of debt, which makes it harder and harder to climb. The other aspect of it also is that the liquidity of the poor pension funds is extremely low, as most of the people in this room know. It's lowest in the country. And when you don't have liquidity, one, in a down market, you're subjecting yourself to the risk of having to sell at significant losses. We experienced that during the midst of the pandemic, and ultimately put a plan in place to accelerate the pension payment so we wouldn't sell at a 20% loss and ultimately give up on what was rounding about less than 1% of investment earnings. Kind of a trade worth making. But very importantly, that lack of liquidity creates a problem when it comes to having the funds to be able to invest, have your interest earnings compound on itself. And again, there's a virtuous cycle there which we're not capturing or benefiting from. And part of the reason why the city's four pension funds historically have performed in a lagging state to other pension funds around the country. The other aspect to this is because the rating agencies have a criteria where, in particular one of them, where if your pension liabilities are so large that it exceeds a certain threshold, you are quadruple dinged in their credit analysis for the size of your pension liability. So you have a large pension liability, you have a credit negative as it relates to that, and then not only that, but then we take that, multiply it 4 times, and apply another credit negative, which only 2 cities in the entire country are applied, and that again drags down the rating, increases your borrowing costs, creates yet another vicious cycle. And so that's where the urgency around pension funding comes from, is that the longer we wait on funding, the more expensive it gets, the more we crowd out services, and ultimately creates that challenge for the city.
Yeah, not much more to add on that. It is a web or a vicious cycle of you have as your ratings are lower, it increases your borrowing costs, the liquidity of each of the funds. Although what's great, I mean, the improvement that's been there certainly has allowed, like the advanced pension payments, which we continued, allows them to do some investment things they weren't able to do recently. Now, in such a surprising way that they're like, oh, we get to finally do that, which is what a normal pension fund would do. But you close those doors when you don't have that excess liquidity because you're trying to get that money out the door to the actual folks that are receiving the benefit. And then, yeah, I mean, carrying such a large pension load, as you heard from Ashley in the beginning, impacts how you can spend your general revenues going forward, as any liability would. The larger that liability takes within those general funds means that you can't do certain things with other revenues that you'd like to. And by not addressing the ultimate problem down the road to try to get to a sustainable level, you're just kind of treading water on that cost and not able to eventually get to that light at the end of the tunnel that would help you in other places.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've heard lots of discussion about the obstacles to reform, the legal, political, and others. Anything either of you want to add to that from your vantage? When you think about what's getting in the way of reform, are we thinking about the right things, or is there something else that we ought to be considering?
I mean, when I said that we'd been having this discussion since 1917, that should read into, because you have that inertia, it becomes less of a priority. That makes really bold decisions that are going to hurt people or cause pain in the immediate future very challenging. And then that kind of feeds into a political challenge where everybody might be behaving in a very rational way to help their constituents, but it's hard to actually move forward a policy that will eventually be beneficial to both the state and the city as a whole.
I would echo that comment around, the awareness, and something I forgot to mention earlier about awareness and relevance is also when you don't have that transparency. And transparency in my time in government, I learned, is not just about putting a lot of information out there, but it's information that's accessible to people. The example I often use, my husband is a PhD in literature and very, very intelligent person. I don't think he could tell you what ratings are. It's kind of a knife in my heart. But very importantly, I have to be able to translate that for him to understand in order for me to make this relevant to people, to then ultimately create that relevance, to create the political will, to then bring about change for something that is very important, which is our financial stability, which pays for taxpayer services, so on and so forth. And the other aspect to that political will also, and it's actually represented in the proposals that came through, all really very good proposals, which have a lot of civic-minded Chicagoans pushing for in different respects. I would offer the winning proposal in a lot of ways is where we were as an administration and where we got to. And the proposals by way of income taxes, as well as the relevance in in social media and other places, is where we would like to be in terms of also creating more will and buy-in to create some of that reform. It's the spectrum of political capital and how you use that capital in a political economy to translate to effective change. The second aspect to this, which I think is so critically important that we haven't really talked about, it may seem touchy-feely at points, is this issue around governance and governance of pension funds. And that exists at a number of different layers. One, for example, is a representation of employees and employers on pension fund boards, where there should, at the very least, be equal representation of both. And we know that that's not the case for many of Chicago's pension funds. Secondly, there's the issue of governance when you consider the tie of accountability of spending and where those pension benefits go and costs of those pension benefits to who has to pay for it. And the most extreme example of that in this current moment is the MEABF contribution that the city makes on behalf of CPS employees. CPS employees are half of the municipal employee pension fund, yet the city of Chicago is on the hook for the entirety of that payment. And in a new governance construct where there's an elected school board, the mayor no longer appoints that school board, and hence the tie of accountability of funding to payment is broken, and at which point then we lose accountability of the governance overall. And then lastly, by way of governance, I would also add the layer of the fact that there are separate pension systems for downstate and for the city of Chicago. And this is translated into a differential in funding, both by the state as well as by way of benefit structures, and pension reform for downstate pension funds, many of which are now consolidated, in particular for police and fire, but also for the city of Chicago. And the bottom line is that a separate is not equal. And we know that that's the construct that exists for these four pension funds, for CTPF, as compared to all of the various other downstate pension funds. So to me, governance is an incredibly important construct which will help drive and align incentives, political will, decision-making going forward that we have to think about and construct. And there may not be money associated with that, but that fixing that construct will ultimately help support the political will and relevance and buy-in that you need to affect change.
Sure, that's good sense. I don't want to put you on the spot, Chase. You happen to serve on some of the very boards that Jenny's talking about. Any reactions, any comments you want to make on the governance side?
Yeah, I mean, for full disclosure, and Jenny is aware of this because she served on these before. I'm on 3 of the 4. And in my prior role, I also advised on some of the state pension boards as well. And that is a challenge. I think that governance points is well made. And there's a challenge to bridge that gap too, because each of the different pension funds are differently funded. There are members within those that would have arguments about why they're now being combined into others, and that is it's a governance and it's a political challenge, which we've been dealing with for a long time. There have been consolidation on the state side on this kind of police and fire downstate. Those were relatively small in comparison, and they also had kind of a different political placement within the state's structure as well. So I would say that is important to note. But I also think it's part of an overall framing conversation, like the governance. We just discussed this. I just said I'm on 3 of the 4 pension funds. Probably half the people here could name the 4. And then there's the collection of state funds, and then there's the downstate funds. And then we have this whole discussion around how do we pay for each of these individually. When you're down in Springfield and you have somebody who is elected to represent, let's say, Grays Lake, Illinois, as a suburb in Lake County, and they went there to represent Grays Lake, it is challenging to bridge the educational gap, not because that person is not necessarily very smart and very interested in trying to solve the problems of the state, but they're there to figure out what is going on in Grays Lake, and this structure is very challenging to drive through reforms that are dealing, like when we say, oh, well, you're addressing this state issue, but you're not fully addressing the city issue, that's very challenging for somebody from that kind of jurisdiction to go through. The other part is when we have financial topics, and I'm glad you brought this up, if I want to say we're going to raise, we're going to sell bonds to raise funds to build a bridge. It's even though finance has its own lexicon and can be very, obfuscating in a lot of ways, which I probably shouldn't have used that word for. I can say, hey, this money is going to raise to pay for that bridge, which is going to be, borne out over, let's say, 30 years on how the bonds are structured, so that 30 years of individuals living near that bridge and using that bridge can benefit and then also share in that payment. That is kind of an easier sell. Mm-hmm. With the pension side, we are investing in people who are providing services to the city of Chicago, but because of how many different groups and how they have all slightly different challenges in some ways, it becomes much more challenging to address the policy in a way that I can sum up in a couple of sentences on either the floor of the General Assembly or in City Council.
Sure.
If I could just add to Chase's comments, there's a really important intergenerational problem when it comes to pensions. With the bridge, you're building a bridge right now that ultimately serves, like the pothole at the street across from me. Now that the city's fixed it, it's a wonderful thing. It's changed my life, and I feel that every single day right now. With pensions, it's a historical problem, and a problem where we underfunded pensions for so many decades. We're now catching up to it. It's starting to crowd out services. It's a payment that's owed and due. It's just like if you don't pay your credit card, you have to pay it at some point in time and the bill's much higher. But that it is ultimately in service of benefits for employees who have already accrued it. It's not a future service that people see.
Right.
And so we're catching up on that now, and ultimately there's a balance between how much you pay for pensions out of city funds and how that impacts the economy. We have a very strong, nearly $800 billion economy, which is a great tool for the city, but we also have to understand that it's extremely fragile in this moment, and how it is that you find solutions to that has to be balanced with continuing to stimulate that growth, because it is one of the greatest tools available to the city in terms of its revenue streams to pay for X, Y, and Z. Sure. So it's a delicate balance, and ultimately that intergenerational aspect of it is just very hard for us to figure out exactly what that balance looks like in the midst of a post-pandemic recovery, and whether paying for it or the vicious cycle that you have, and how do you balance all of that.
Which speaks to what you're saying about making sure you're addressing the issue as much as you can now, is because of past decisions where it was out of sight, out of mind, and some of this liability, if you don't continue to do that, that generational gap even actually becomes even more elongated and problematic, honestly.
Sure, sure. Hence, one of the big motivations for having the next generation sound off on the problem, which is a big part of why we're here. We're going to do a couple more questions and then open up to all of you. So as you're listening in, be thinking about questions that you'd like to put to our panelists. We could spend all night talking about the constitutional protections in place for pensions. Certainly, you talked about when people say, well, it's different in Illinois or it's different in Chicago. That is indeed one of the things that is unique. I guess at a very high level, there's sort of two questions that have come up often as we've been working through this issue the last 6 months. And one of them is, how big a constraint is it really when you think particularly on the benefits side? And two, in your assessment, Is it fixed forever? Is there anything that could potentially be done to rethink that? Again, in 30 seconds, feel free.
From a constitutional perspective?
Yeah.
So just for those unaware, pension benefits are enshrined within the 1970 Constitutional Convention. Illinois, through its history, has had conventions, although we have not had one since 1970, where they remake large portions of the Constitution. In fact, the state comptroller's office comes from that 1970 Constitution. So did my old office, the banking office. So I guess the very short portion of that would be, in theory, since we've had constitutional conventions in the past, we could certainly have one in the future. It has come up. It goes to the, I never say it's impossible not to revisit something that somebody passed at some point, especially in a situation where in some of our lifetimes it was passed. When I talk about pension reform, I get a little bit hesitant to talk about constitutional changes for two reasons. One, these are benefits that are owed. In a lot of ways, pensions are a promise. You incentivized the employee to start there under that promise. So changing that, I do have a little bit, and that's a personal constraint of mine. Second, I've seen a lot of constitutional proposals in my time. Very few of them have been successful. And the ones that were successful were very clear, well-funded, and usually about something that everybody really wanted to get passed. And if you look at other states, it boils down to, well, is it marijuana? Because that's probably going to pass. Is it protecting a woman's right to choose? Probably going to pass. Anything outside of that realm becomes challenging. Now, Arizona has passed laws. I'm not saying it isn't impossible, but I usually like to focus on things that are not around the constitutional change, just because I think it is a very tall hill to climb.
Sure.
So it may be surprising for folks to hear this, but I also believe pensions are a promise, and that you have city workers, lots of them police officers, firefighters, other city workers who have sacrificed a lot to be city workers, who have worked their time based on an agreement and a benefit that was promised to them. Aside from the constitutional issues, and some states have an ability to go back and change benefits and rethink that, there's a moral issue of the fact that people have worked their time and have accrued those benefits. To me, the bigger challenge around this when we talk about the benefit side is the fact that we are at risk and continue to be at risk of additional pension benefits being given away. So not the historical benefits and going back and retracing that, which, by the way, has been litigated, and thankfully so we now know the answer to whether or not you can actually go back and change those benefits, but that we continue to give away benefits, which is a problem. And and again, going back to the point about transparency, giving away benefits in a way where it's intended to fix something, but not actually fixing it, and making sure we understand that. Again, my personal view of this, obviously you can debate the pros and cons of any policy, but the Tier 2 fixes, we have to make sure we all understand that is in fact fixing the Social Security safe harbor issues, which is what the purported rationale for that is. By the way, Social Security doesn't appear anywhere in the bill, but that ultimately we know exactly what that Social Security safe harbor is, which we did a lot of work at the city around, and I would offer that in fact those benefits provided are in excess of that Social Security safe harbor. Can't have that conversation if you haven't done the analysis around that. So that's, to me, where it is. And ultimately, it makes sense that we're now in this moment legislatively where some of those bills are starting to be considered, because the city has, over a number of years, really over the last decade plus, significantly increased its pension contributions, so that even if we haven't diminished the liability and still a very large liability, we are now a city who has incorporated within its budget a way to pay for those liabilities. And not only have we found a way to pay for the statutory contribution, but an advanced contribution to at least keep to the tread water level where those liabilities aren't massively growing over subsequent years. Now that that stability has come, then ultimately it creates incentives to go and get that next benefit. And that's where, again, that conversation is so critically important for us to ensure that we're not saddling future generations with even more liabilities without funding sources attached to it, and a robust conversation around what the right balance there is.
Sure, sure. One more question before we go to questions from all of you. Think about the time frame. Is this something that a mayor could do in a 4-year term? Is this something that we need to be thinking in decades? When we think about solutions, what's the runway that we probably need to realistically consider?
Well, when you say this, you're meaning solving a crisis that has been for a while. I think just as generationally, we have put ourselves into this position through underfunding our pension system and different moves throughout our history. It'll likely take multiple steps in order to move forward to make significant progress. And the reason why I bring that up is, and there was a lot of good ideas and a lot of different types of thoughts that were presented in all of the different presentations. Some of them were federal, some of them were state, some of them were city. It just knowing, I have in the back of my head, okay, so in general, you can't do pension reform in the second term because then people are running for a re-election, but then the governor's going to want. I mean, it's hard to get an entire slate of things that are quite revolutionary sometimes within a 2 or 4 or even 8-year process. Doesn't mean large jumps can't happen. Doesn't mean that in the course of a few months, major milestones might occur. I'm thinking of back years ago when I was working for the state and they were passing gay marriage, which I know you're all shocked that I just brought that up, but that bill was impossible until it wasn't. Literally months before that bill passed, and I was around for that, the votes weren't there. It wasn't really that close, quite frankly. And then things started to move in a direction, and then it was possible. Pensions are harder because when you're talking about something that is dealing with families or individuals, they can feel that, and that can create momentum. But impossible things can be possible, and then suddenly a few things are possible. So it wouldn't surprise me. And we should work toward the ability to make large movements in tall strides, but it is very challenging to do everything you want all in the course of a couple of months or a year or even 4 years.
I think the short answer is 2055 and 2058. See, I'm in a room of pension geeks here.
There you go.
I had a little bit of laughter there. I would agree with Chase. I think it's a very difficult problem to address in any one term, and there are all the vagaries of when you go for legislation, how you build consensus around legislation, and ultimately building the groundwork for passing legislation. When you look at pension reform across other cities, and and Chicago is no stranger to pension discussions, there are few of them that have seen meteoric rises in pension funding levels in a very short time frame. Probably a few here and there, but by and large, it's a challenge that's going to take time, and it's going to take time for us to make our way to better funding, to this schedule that we've laid out for ourselves to 90% funding. I think that the really important thing is making sure with each and subsequent administrations, where there's always an ebb and flow of policy, and it's the right of every administration to decide what they think is the right way forward for the city at any given time. But that, very importantly, we always move the needle forward to what the ultimate goal is, which is not saddling this debt on the economy, on our future taxpayers, on my kids who hopefully will be Chicagoans at the time, and that we find a path forward to better sustainability. Because we know that the city of Chicago is near dead last in terms of funding, and that's a problem that we have to address, has been addressed, and that we continue to make progress in that respect.
Well said. Okay, we have time for questions from all of you, and I think we have a microphone. Yes. Thank you, Swapna.
Thank you. This question is for Chase, and you're the city controller. Could you give any insight into the progress that's been made by the mayor's pension group that was formed about a year ago?
Yeah, so they meet regularly, and that's led in a lot of ways, well, primarily by Jill Jaworski, the CFO, and I am part of that group. It has been a lot of conversations with the state, Senator Martwick, those folks that are really kind of the pension folks in the General Assembly right now in Springfield. I think they've been relatively positive conversations, a lot about Tier 2, and obviously, because that's top of mind. I think there's going to need to be more conversations as we get past this. So for folks that are unaware, the legislative session will usually, there are a few situations where it hasn't, usually ends at the end of May. And there'll be more conversations throughout the summer going into what's called veto and lame duck session. But so far, I think it's been a positive relationship with the state. I know it's always challenging because there are a bunch of folks represented in that group. I can't really talk about details, I don't think, but I know that Jill will be speaking more about that as they go forward. And I cannot see it all. There we go.
Hi. So my question is about research. So we all know we do need more research, but between like more individual level political behavior or more population level economic research, which one is more impactful and more urgent to this crisis?
I could start.
Yeah.
I would say it's both. If I were to had to pick and prioritize, I would say it's the broader, more populist understanding of the financial challenges related to pensions. Having said that, you also want your research and your awareness to lead to action. And so having the understanding of what the cost of current legislation, of current actions that are being taken to change what those pension costs are. I saw, some of the snapshots of one of the proposals around, pensions cost you $4 million a day, and that's the kind of stuff my husband would understand. And to me, having that translation of what's happening right now related to pensions, why action is so necessary, into a way that most people who aren't pension experts can understand, I would prioritize that, very highly.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm thinking of this more in terms of, I think a general interest in retirement products, savings, investments, structures would be beneficial to be more publicly known. And like a concerted effort that that rises the average level of education on those topics is not just beneficial to the pension discussion, but like for everyone. I mean, there's some very scary statistics about the average amount of money that Americans save for retirement. And I think pensions are part of that conversation. I mean, we're kind of entering a generation where pensions are becoming rarer and rarer outside of the public sector. Whereas, my father and my grandfather, that was a pretty common occurrence. So even having a discussion about what a pension is kind of being lost from the public consciousness.
Right.
So I'd probably stick to, if you, both are important, but kind of rising general education is probably most acutely right now.
And just to add that to that point too, having a conversation around why is this so important to any of us? Most people nowadays don't stay somewhere for 10 years. And to vest after 10 years, I vested, by the way, I'm a member of MEABF, but it took me a really long time to get there. And would I ever actually, if I had been half a year short, so is it actually really something that we care about now in this current generation for the next tier or not? I learned something out of the pension proposals, for example, about how much it costs me specifically in terms of the pension debt that's out there. And it's really kind of shocking. And so I think that conversation is just very important.
Sure. Yeah, so for everyone looking for seminar papers and doctoral students looking for research, I think we just laid out a great agenda for you. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the presentation, and thank you to the team for your ideas. I just want to maybe make a point more than ask a question, but I am curious about the reaction. I think one of the points that the winning team made was to revitalize property in the city would be a revenue enhancer. I just want to connect it to the point that anything we can do to grow the local economy makes today's pensions more affordable. And so I think, Jenny, you had said we have an $800 billion economy out here. If we had a $900 billion economy, pensions would be that much more affordable. So I just want to commend the team for the insight and the connection to say that, growth can help make this problem more tolerable. I just was sort of curious, your connection or sort of your thoughts on that, and whether there's any additional sort of pro-growth policies or pro-resident policies that maybe might come to mind, given the connection, the innovation the team had brought to us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad growth was a part of the discussion because it sometimes often just becomes funding questions, but growth is important. And I'm sure you've heard this many times, and I've probably said it before, you can't grow yourself out of that situation. That's certainly true, or at least very unlikely. But growth should always be part of the conversation. Part of that is also increasing things that you wouldn't normally think of, like trying to not just look at lifting up businesses and different real estate ideas and things like that, but also increasing the money velocity within those communities, which is also a driver of output in ways you can't always measure very well. Now, we always think of money velocity being kind of a constant, but in very small communities, you can really see how that makes a difference to, things that are actually coming back to the city in other ways through sales tax and things like that. So, yeah, certainly.
Spoken like a true banker, by the way.
Yeah, you can tell my banking lineage on that. But that being said, it is definitely part of the conversation because it can't be just, all right, well, now we're just going to raise this new fundraising measure. But growth is also a challenge. And so is, by the way, and I want to make this point because, I'm sure Jenny will as well, so is actually creating a new funding mechanism. You can try to estimate as best you want, but I have a long paper describing our historical understanding of where we got money from the Skyway to kind of show you about how things can fall short in certain ways. So it is a challenge, and it is important to balance it out as well.
Yeah, I would just add growth is critically important. Growing the pie is one of the best ways to be able to fund these obligations without a whole lot of pain. And then the other aspect to that, just given the perspective of having managed through what was the largest economic fallout in at least a century in the midst of the pandemic, we spent a lot of time thinking about growth, about the lack of growth in the moment, and about our role as government to create stimulus in that moment to then spur growth in that recovery. And we saw that very clearly, not necessarily as much from our stimulus, which I think was also important, largest in the history, investments in X, Y, and Z. Won't go through all of that now. But in particular, the stimulus provided by the federal government in the midst of the pandemic, we had forecasted a number of various different types of models for the revenue recovery for different types of revenues, different types of revenue recovery profiles, Nike swoosh, V-shaped, so on and so forth. And no matter what, we were all wrong about those forecasts. Luckily for the most of us, the state and the city, we were wrong to the conservative end, ended up seeing a fairly significant growth because that stimulus was such a strong factor in that recovery profile. So instead of this longer kind of recovery, we saw a very quick V-shaped recovery, and one that was so strong that it created hundreds of millions of dollars of additional revenues over what we had forecasted, which then allowed us to use that money for the pension advance, which then allowed us to put the policy in place, which then ultimately led to the rating upgrade, out of junk status, and then, again, creating more of that virtuous cycle rather than a vicious cycle. So I absolutely think growth is critically important. And in this post-pandemic environment, one of my greatest fears in leaving office was the fragileness of our economy and how it is that we continue to stimulate that growth. Because if you can do that, $1 goes a long way, tenfold, whatever the leveraging up of that is, and at which point then it helps all of us in getting to where we need to be.
Great points. Time for maybe one or two more. I'm looking for Jody or Swapna to give us the hook if we need to. Time for a couple more questions. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I have a real nerd question that I was just curious about, which is...
You've come to the right place.
So you alluded to the fact that the city is required to get to 90% funding by 2055 and 2058. And I guess my question is something I used to see on T-shirts at UChicago, which is, that's fine and good in practice, but how does it work in theory?
Right.
Do you think 90% is like the optimal funding ratio? Do you think it's necessary to get to 100, or do you think, and this is a kind of hard question because I feel like there are a lot of motivated reasoning with like near-term financial impacts of where you actually set the amortization target, which is why I think 90% works in practice. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about like the optimal end funding ratio.
Sure. And some of this gets to your ratings agency comments, I would imagine, too, right?
Yep.
It used to be 100, by the way. They used to push to make everybody 100% funded.
Yeah.
And then there was an argument for years and years and years. It doesn't really make a ton of sense to that. And then it becomes a discussion about 90. Sorry, I cut you off, Jim.
No.
But like, no. I mean, it's a fair question because you can make an argument when we're sitting around 25%, that you're like, well, people are still getting their benefits. You know, what's the problem? But, you know, Jenny had brought up all the challenges that implies. So is there something between 20 and 90 that makes some sense? The issue, though, is the closer you get to 100, the less of a future burden you end up accruing to yourself. So in theory, you're kind of banking savings that you wouldn't if you tried to go down the road of let's look at 85 or 80 or 70. If you look at the state's funded ratio over time, we were, in a lot of ways, policy was kind of driving at 70% in the 1970s and 80s, which was kind of strange, but that was kind of what decisions had been made at that time. So like anything, and you probably saw this shirt also at the University of Chicago, which is "It depends," is you have a trade-off in your dollars, right? So the closer you get to 90% or 100%, you are making a benefit that maybe you won't have to spend extra dollars later if there's some sort of event that occurs or something else that's unpredictable. But the trade-off in those dollars are things you could be using somewhere else within the city's budget or the state's budget if it's a state situation. So how'd you like that dance around that question?
I would offer at being at a funded ratio that's in the low 20s. It's really not actually that important for us to figure out 90 versus 100. Sorry, Brendan.
That's a fair point. Yeah.
Like, you know, I ran the Chicago Marathon in my time off, and it's like we're at the 1 mile mark, and we got to get to 26. So, you know, having said that, there are, you know, some things to think about there. So if you are at 100% funded, should we be so lucky, you know, there's always the pressure of trying to then add more benefits to then, you know, continue to address those political needs. So there's that aspect of it. Justin, you mentioned the rating agencies. They amortize our pension liabilities anyway to 100%. So at which point, if you want to try to pay as little as possible, you know, you're going to think about what they calculate as our pension liabilities, as we did with the pension advance, and trying to get to what they see as effectively a true structural balance, because that not paying that amount that they calculate is ultimately a deficit on a borrowing and a structural deficit. So I think that in any case, you know, progress is important. Just like if you're at the 1 mile mark of a marathon, it's about getting to mile 2 and mile 3 and not going backwards or stopping, and that we just need to continue to make progress towards better funding.
Definitely. We're told we have time for one more question.
Hello. There was a City Council Finance Committee hearing today on issuing affordable housing bond using revenue from expiring TIF increment. I wonder what you all think of that idea and whether it would not instead be preferable to dedicate the revenue to paying off pensions.
So, I'm sorry, say the last part of it again?
Would it instead be preferable to use the revenue from the expiring TIF increment to pay
Instead
off
for
pensions?
pensions. Okay, I got you. I'm probably the least surprised person. I mean, you're asking a member of the finance team how to grade their financial proposal they just made. Yeah, we did it awesome. We kicked ass on the whole. Yeah. No, I mean, you know, it's a discussion on where you're looking at different benefits, and another significant issue in the city of Chicago is housing and homelessness. I mean, that's why you saw, you know, the ballot initiative on Bring Chicago Home. There's a lot of tools that need to go toward that. That also, not addressing that issue has significant burdens on both costs, infrastructure costs to us, as well as businesses in general. So, you know, it's a policy decision that I support because we need to address that problem as well. When you're doing budgeting in different public finance issues, it's a testament to trying to figure out how to plug all of the holes that you need to plug with the resources you have, and you always don't have enough resources. So you can certainly think about it in terms of, well, could we do that toward pension? Pension will relieve some of our financial burdens down the road. But I would argue that, you know, it makes a certain amount of sense, especially since TIFs themselves are kind of affiliated with, you know, you've all talked about Govian taxation, I'm sure. You know, you're dealing with kind of a real estate value attached tax going toward trying to assist with some of the housing issues that are value attached as well in the city.
You know, I think the crux of your question is, should the money have been spent for pensions? And it's always a challenge to think about where money should or shouldn't be spent in a vacuum. It's about priorities. It's about where the current needs are and how emergency they are versus money that has maybe been allocated for certain priorities and what proportion. And ultimately, that's the job of, you know, folks in the office, and a difficult one to balance.
Well said. I want to first and foremost thank our events team here at Harris for putting on a really excellent event this evening. Jody and Swapna in particular. Thank you to all of the Harris faculty staff, everyone else who contributed to the Pension Innovation Challenge this year. Made it a wonderful experience for all involved, and as you see from the students and their presentations, I think it turned out really, really well. So one more round of applause for the Pension Innovation Challenge and everyone who helped. We have food and refreshments at the table right behind me. So to wrap up what we have here for you tonight, I want to again thank Jenny and Chase for an excellent conversation.
Thank you.
I know we've all certainly learned a lot, and all of you feel free to stick around and continue the conversation. And thanks again to everyone for coming out and for a perhaps surprisingly fun and engaging 6 months of conversations about pensions. We hope to see more of it in the future. As you drive home tonight on Untold Lakeshore Drive, make note and remember what it used to be like, depending on how. Thank you all again for coming out, and have a great rest of the evening.